speaker, Dr. Janica Nordstrom. She is a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney, Australia. As she says, in a past life, Janica was a high school teacher and a Swedish heritage language school teacher as well. Her primary research now focuses on heritage language schools. In Australia, they called community language schools, with a particular focus on social justice and educational equity. She is a member of the Sydney Institute for Community Languages Education and works closely with key stakeholders, including heritage language schools, mainstream schools, tertiary institutions, and state departments on improving teaching and learning in heritage language schools. In her presentation, entitled Engaging Students in Heritage Language Education, Bridging Perspectives for Enhanced Learning, she explores both theory and practice of motivation in heritage language education. Drawing on research into students' and parents' motivations for heritage language schooling, she examines how different stakeholders perceive heritage language schooling, what drives them, and how we can enhance students' motivation in the classroom. Thank you very much for joining us, Janica.
Well, thank you for having me. Do you mind if I share my screen now?
Yep, I will stop sharing.
Excellent. Hold on, and there we go. We should be live. And I'm also just going to rearrange my screen so that I can sort of both see you and see my screen at the same time. So hi everyone, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very excited to be here and talk to you about engaging students in heritage language education, which is one of my main interests. I do want to mention, as was mentioned before, that I am zooming in from Australia, and in Australia it is currently 3 a.m. I do have some speaker notes to keep myself on track. But if I say something that doesn't make sense, it's probably because my brain is saying that it's sleep time. So if that happens, do just put in a comment in the chat or whatever. It's like, did you really just say that? Or what's you going on about? And I promise I will clarify it as we go. So there we go. I would also like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to the Aboriginal people of the land where I live and work. So Australian Aboriginal culture is the world's oldest still living culture in the world. The Aboriginal people of Australia have lived here for over 65,000 years. So before colonisation, there were hundreds of nations in Australia, and their stories and their travels and their meetings are connected through what they call their songlines. So these people were here on this land in 1788 when the first fleet arrived. There were about 200, back then there were about 500 languages spoken on this continent, and today we still have around 250 of those languages that are still spoken today, although many, if not all of them, are struggling for survival. So when the Europeans came to Australia, many battles and wars took place on this land. So it was not a peaceful settlement, and the land was never ceded. And as part of Australia's reconciliation, it's now customary to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional custodians, like I am doing right now. So for me, that includes the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. That's the land upon which the University of Sydney stand and where I work. But I also want to acknowledge the Darawal people, which is where I live. And this correlates to Sydney in Australia, as well as Wollongong, which is just south of Australia. In Darawal language, they say Nagangbi or welcome. So Nagangbi to my presentation, or välkomna, as we say in Swedish. And I also encourage you all to say hello in the chat in your own language. Before I start, I will just give you a little bit more background to who I am. And Aga did a great summary, or more than a summary, of what I do. But as you know, I live in Australia. I was born in Sweden. You probably figured that one out. I moved to Australia in 2006. In 2006, I also started teaching as a community language school teacher. And as they said before, community language school is the term that we use in Australia for heritage language schools. or complementary schools, Saturday schools, whatever they might be called, where you are at the moment. And since 2015, I have been working at the University of Sydney, where I am teaching courses in language literacy and diversity, and I do research into heritage language education. So my talk today is going to be about motivation, as you know. I'm going to be talking about something called visions. I'm going to talk about the importance of having visions for long-term motivation. Going to be talking about the relationship between visions and students learning in the classroom. Going to talk about what we know about heritage language visions, motivation, and classroom practices from a research perspective. And I'm also going to talk about how to build a vision, as well as some of the strategies that we can draw on to increase student motivation. So actually, we're going to start with a little bit of an experiment. And I would like to say as well that for this presentation, if you do have a phone next to you, that would be useful, because there are a couple, not too many, I promise, but there are a couple of engaging activities where you will be asked to contribute a bit. So if you have a phone, that would be fabulous. And the first experiment that we are going to do is that, and bear with me because it's the first time I run this one on Zoom. So we're going to see how that one goes as well. But I want you to think of a language that you have always wanted to learn. And I'm going to ask you to close your eyes in a second. You don't have to close them yet. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes in a second, and I'm going to read you a script or a story. So I'm going to give you about 10 seconds now just to consider what language it is. So I want you to think of a language that you have always wanted to learn. So a language that you don't know yet, but one that you want to learn. Or maybe it's one that you're already learning, or maybe it's one that you've always dreamed about learning. All right. Now I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. And I'm going to read you a story. So I want you to think of a language that you've always wanted to learn. I want you to imagine yourself in the future. Imagine that you speak that language pretty well. Picture yourself in a real life situation where you are using that particular language. I want you to pay attention to where you are. So what can you see around you? Who's with you? Maybe you're traveling to a country where the language is spoken. Maybe you're meeting a friend who's speaking that language. Think about what you're talking about and how it makes you feel. Now think not just about the language, but think about your connections with the people. So how are you feeling? I want you to zoom out a little bit and think about how this language fluency is impacting your future life. So has it, for example, opened up new opportunities for you? So what about in your personal life or in your career? In your understanding of other cultures? All right, I want you to open your eyes again, but I don't want you to forget about those visions. This is where we're going to get a little bit engaging. So I want you to head to this Padlet. So I'm glad that I'm not the only one using Padlets today, because I saw there was one posted. I will also see if I can copy this one and put it in the chat for those who prefer to use their All right, well, I'm hoping that you got the link. And I will go back to this one. There we go. And on the Padlet, you should have been able to access the Padlet. I want you to answer some of these questions. I want you to share some of your visions on this Padlet. So you don't need to answer all of the questions. pick one or two where you can share something from your vision. So I'll give you all a second or two, a couple of minutes, just to pop in. What did you see? What was the languages? Where were you in your vision? What were you talking about?
Janica, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Can you share a link to the Padlet in the chat? Thank you, thank you.
I'll try to get it happening here again. I might just need to do this. I can't copy paste it at the same time. That's the only reason. So I'll just do this one. There you go. Oh, thank you, Sabina. Well, we've got lots of language: Italian, Spanish, Warao, Korean. There's a lot of Spanish up there. At a bakery, great story. A concert, or in my living room, the university, traveling, on the beach. What were you talking about? Chatting with friends, ordering bread and cakes, meeting local people, daily life, current affairs, just things you're doing. Yeah, great. Now, how it makes you feel, warm connection, confidence, meeting new people. Great responses. So you can feel free to keep putting things in there. And I want you to remember what the visions were and what the things were that you put in there. And we are going to come back to that one. So there we go. And so what's the connection between visions, like what you were just doing, and motivations? And why is visions important? So I'm going to start by introducing you to Zoltán Dörnyei. That's the guy on the picture that you can see there. He was a Hungarian-born researcher and academic who sadly passed away in 2022. So Zoltán Dörnyei is widely known, particularly for his research into language learning motivation and helping us understand how motivation affects the way that people learn languages. So him and his colleague Jill Hadfield, they were also the ones who wrote the script that I just read to you. So Dörnyei argues that there are many techniques and strategies that we can use to encourage short-term motivation in the classroom. I am going to address some of those later, but more than anything, what we need is long-term commitment. And having a long-term commitment to something or long-term motivation for something requires a vision. And it's this idea of a vision that is central to Zoltán's ideas around motivation, because having a vision is one of the most motivational tools that we know of for long-term commitments. So what is a vision? So a vision is a goal plus an image. So it's an image-enhanced goal. These together, having a goal of something one wants to achieve and an image of doing it, of themselves succeeding, together is a vision. So visions are super powerful. So they can empower people to act and they can lead to extraordinary things. So visions are different from daydreaming in that there is an actional component. So something actually happens as a result of that vision. So Martin Luther King Jr., for example, he had a vision. He had a vision of racial equality and justice in United States. It was a very visual imagery for him, which he called the dream, as you know, of the red hills of Georgia, where the sons of former slaves and sons of former slave owners sat together at the table of brotherhood. So visions are powerful and visions are transformational. Now, in language learning context, the vision that students have of themselves as second language speakers is one of the most reliable indicators of persistent effort. So our visions of ourselves in the future is a super strong motivator for learning and the most consistent predictor for language learning success. So visions are the strongest force that can create long-term commitment for language learners. And that is because people have ideas of what they might become, would like to become, and what they are afraid of becoming. So these are not long-term goals because they include images. They are visions. So ourselves and who we are don't just exist in the present, but also in the past, as well as in an imagined future. So we might envision something we would like to become in the future. So me, for example, I'm into gardening. I would love to become a permaculture gardener. Or we might envision that we become a policeman or an electrician. Or we might imagine ourselves as changing, such as becoming more friendly, less grumpy with our children, more fit, whatever. And it is based on these visions that Dernier introduced what he called the L2 motivational system, which you can see on the screen at the moment, in 2005. So L2 in this context stands for second language. So it's essentially a second language motivational system. I'm going to pause here for a second, just to say that in heritage language learning, we don't necessarily always appreciate the term second language. There's many reasons for this, such as that heritage language sometimes actually being the first language, or sometimes it's the third language. And in that sense, it might make more sense to think of the motivational system as the other language motivational system. However, I am going to refer to it as the second language just to align it with Dernier's theories around motivation. So there are three parts to this system. It's the ideal L2 self, the ought to L2 self, and the learning experience. So the ideal L2 self is the most powerful motivator. So this sense of self is about our visions of who we want to become. It is about our hopes for the future, our aspirations, what we want to achieve. So it's a realistic vision of who we could become. And the theory goes that when we have a realistic vision that we find attractive, we are motivated to work towards achieving it. So I might, for example, be learning Arabic. I might have a vision where I imagine myself traveling through Arabic-speaking countries, having conversations with people I meet. Now, the stronger the vision and my hopes and aspirations are, the harder I will work towards achieving it. Now, the ought to L2 self, on the other hand, while it is also motivating, it is not as motivating as the ideal L2 self. So the ought to L2 self refers to who we think we should be. So it is about perceived pressures from others, from society, from parents, from community, and so forth. So it's about prevention, preventing us from becoming something we shouldn't be, and it is regulated by a sense of responsibility and obligation. So this may be related to a sense of, I have to speak Swedish because my family thinks it's important. Now, the visions we form are also very closely related to our attitudes of the target community. So the more positive our attitudes and perceptions are of that community, the more attractive our ideal L2 self is. Our perceptions of that L2 community is often referred to as an imagined community, and I will be using that term a few times in the next 45 minutes. So it's called an imagined community, and not because it doesn't exist, but more so because it's not physically present. So through imagination, learners can bond with people they have not met, but with whom they create a sense of belonging. And that's going to bring us to the next interactive part of this activity. Now I only have two, so there's not too many. So with this one, I want you to go to menti.com and I want you to enter the code 87159669. So we're going to think about your heritage language, your students, your heritage language learners. Why do you think that your students are learning the heritage language? What do you think motivates your students to learn the language? There's a couple of questions in the Menti that I want you to respond to. I'm going to open it up here too. So as you can see, you can put in up to 3 options on the Mentimeter as to why you think that your students are learning the heritage language. Pretty even at the moment between parental pressure and to communicate with family members. If you did put in other reason, feel free to share that reason in the chat as well. Right, we're starting to get a winner. With most people thinking that to communicate with family members is the main reason, followed by because the parents say they have to, as well as because it's part of their heritage and identity. So I'm going to go back to the presentation. There. And I'm going to unpack some of what the research has shown us into this. So I want to stress, though, that each study into heritage language learning is a study into a unique context. So it may not be transferable to your particular context, but it may nonetheless give you food for thought and allow you to make comparisons between your own context and other contexts. So firstly, we know from both research and anecdotal evidence that it is often the parents' decisions to enroll a student in a heritage language school. So parents are therefore important stakeholders in heritage language schools because, as we know, after all, they take their children there every week. So talking to parents, we know that identity plays an important part in why they want their children to learn the heritage language. So for example, they say things like the children must learn Chinese because they are Chinese, or that learning the language reinforces the children's Swedishness, or that they have to learn Bengali because Bengali is our language and it is their roots. So to many parents, it's also about belonging. So it's about belonging with speakers of that language. So they learn the heritage language to fit in with that community and as a gateway to that culture and that community. Parents also say that it's important for intergenerational communication, so very much similar to what you were clicking on the Mentimeter, and that they have to be able to talk to grandparents, to cousins, and so on. For some parents, although to a lesser extent, it's also important that the children become bilingual. So we have come across in the research every now and then that parents think that it's the idea of bilingualism that is attractive with the heritage language learning rather than the heritage identity itself. So, for example, it might make sense that a child is learning Swedish because it is part of their heritage, but it's also important that they learn another language. And some parents in Australia expressed this as they wanted their children to become less Aussie, so less Australian, and that's why one of the reasons why they attend the heritage language or send their children attends the heritage language school. So parents' visions are primarily about building a sense of identity. So it's a sense of I am. That's the vision they want for their children. They want their children to become or feel ownership of that heritage identity. So thinking back to Dernier's L2 motivational system, this can also become part of the children's O2 L2 self. So where they feel that they should learn the language because it is part of their heritage or because their parents put pressure on them. So looking at what we know about students' visions, it's a bit more diverse. So you will see that students want to learn a language for identity purposes, or that they learn Chinese because they are Chinese, or Somali because it's their language. Sometimes students feel that they must learn it so that others don't get the impression that they are not native speakers. So they might feel as they need to learn the language to fit in, or even sometimes that it is shameful to not be able to speak that language. But for students, it's also a bit more complicated. So students acknowledge the expectations placed upon them by parents and broader community members, but they also learn the language for other reasons. So these include things like future travels, study, and work. So a student might feel that knowing the heritage language will make them more attractive on the job market, look good on their CV, give them better exam credentials, and so on. To some, it's also the idea of being bilingual or speaking another language that's very attractive. To some, they actually express it as it's really cool to speak another language. It's something that makes them stand out with their peers. So that's a motivation that relates to how they want to perceive themselves or their ideal L2 self. So it's about their hopes and their aspirations. And this aspect of heritage language learning is much less emphasized by the parents. So for parents, the benefits around work and CV and travels and friends is an added bonus. But for the students, it's often the identity or the heritage, the belonging that is the added bonus. And this part of students' visions and aspirations can be really powerful motivators for them in terms of long-term commitment to learn the heritage language. But having a vision and forming bonds with an imagined community is not enough. So this is about the learning experience. So a student can have a vision of who they might want to become or perceive themselves as part of, an imagined community. They see themselves as speakers connecting with these people, but they might still not be engaged in the classroom. And this brings us to a Canadian researcher named Bonnie Norton. So Bonnie Norton often uses the concept of investments. So Bonnie doesn't actually use the word vision very much, instead uses the term imagined identity. So it's very similar to vision, and it refers to an individual's perception of their future, of their desires, of their aims, of who they want to become. So it's their hopes for the future and what they envision beyond the classroom walls. So it refers to someone they imagine themselves to become. So Bonnie says that when a student engages in their learning, they invest in an imagined community. Now, students are most motivated to invest when there is an alignment between their imagined community and imagined identity and what is actually happening in the classroom. Similarly, students may be less motivated to learn the language if there is a misalignment between their future vision of themselves and the people they want to connect to on the one hand, and what is happening in the classroom on the other hand. So this concept of investment moves motivation away from something inside our heads to the context in which where the learning is taking place. So Bonnie uses a very good example of this, which is about a Vietnamese immigrant in Canada called May. So May was hoping to one day become an office worker in Canada, right? It was her vision, or her imagined community. She wanted to become an office worker. It was her future aspiration. It was her motivation for why she was learning English in this case. But in the classroom, much to May's disappointment, they spent a lot of time talking about past and intercultural experiences. So although May was motivated to learn English, she had little investment and she complained about the classroom practices. So May couldn't make connections between the language learning classroom and her vision. So from a teaching perspective, it then becomes clear that if we want to encourage the long-term commitment and the long-term motivation by our learners, we also need to draw on the students' visions. So in a little bit, I'm going to talk to you about some practical ideas around how you can work with this in your classroom and how you can draw the students' visions into your teaching. So returning to May, the Vietnamese immigrant, May wanted to become an office worker. That was her vision, or her imagined community. That was the people that she wanted to form a connection with. But because this was not represented in her language learning environment, she was becoming frustrated. She was still motivated to learn English, but there's a misalignment between her hopes and aspirations and what actually happened in the classroom. Now, in heritage language education, we know what motivates the parents is linked to a sense of identity, but also nationalism, generating pride in a heritage culture, or even a sense of nostalgia. So sometimes it's also about teaching social values or correct behaviors. At one Swedish school that I visited in Australia, it was almost like a brigadoon, if you watched the movie. It's like an island that appeared once a week where all things Swedish came together for that 2 hours on the weekend. Studies in the UK, such as that by Adrian Blackledge and Angela Crease, they also found that while it is clear that the main activity is language teaching in heritage language schools, the teaching of affiliation to the homeland is one of the motivating principles of the schools. So it's no surprise then that much of what is happening in many heritage language classrooms is strongly linked to culture, history, social values in some sense. That aligns with the vision parents and teachers have, or wanting their children to connect to that community and form a sense of belonging. Now, at the same time, however, it has been observed how students sometimes contest or object to the classroom practices. So your students might challenge what is being said in the classroom, might make fun of activities, they might not be engaged. So this can happen because there is, similar to May, a misalignment between what the students expect and their experience and what is happening in the classroom. Now, Li Wei and Chao Jung Wu, for example, who are another pair of UK researchers, visited Chinese schools in the UK, and they found that students very much contextualize their goals for Chinese language learning in this case in the future. So China was perceived as a growing economy, very important for their future. Outside of school, they often engaged in contemporary youth interests in Chinese, such as pop culture. However, these interests and aspirations were rarely reflected in the teaching. And Becky Francis, which is another UK researcher working with Louise Archer and Ada Mao, they came to similar conclusions, where heritage language learners felt that what they did at heritage language schools didn't reflect how the students saw themselves or their futures and their interest in pop culture, such as contemporary TV, music, movies, anime, soap operas. These sort of things were rarely included in the learning. So are these mutually exclusive? So no, of course not. But as Patricia Duff and Lee says, that if schools focus solely on heritage language, on a heritage linked to a past that bears little resemblance with students' interests, motivations, and aspirations, then it may drive students away from the community language rather than towards it. So relating back to what both parents and student wants in terms of creating a sense of belonging, and a sense of identity, these researchers have also found that this sense of belonging that both parents and students strive for has less to do with the content of the lessons and more to do with being there at the heritage language school with other people from the same background. So by knowing your students, their visions and aspirations, you have the power to generate or encourage motivation in your classroom. But let's face it, many heritage language learners are there because their parents tell them that they have to. They might very well have a vision and aspirations, but their teenage brains or whatever age they are might say that it's much more fun and much more motivating to go and hang out with their friends or do sport or do something else that is not heritage language learning on the weekend. So this is why we as teachers need to make sure that our classroom practices are encouraging motivation and that we generate initial motivation through classroom practices. So this includes steps such as building good relationships with students and between students, creating a positive atmosphere in the classroom, including setting realistic goals, relevant activities, and giving student choice and agency. So good relationships is about the social relationships. These are super influential on initial motivation. You all would recall, if you look at a high school student who is going to choose their elective, a major fact in how they choose their elective is whether or not they like the teacher, right? So the relationships we form and that the students form can make or break a classroom. And we know from language learning research that positive peer interactions and supportive teacher relationships significantly enhance student motivation and learning. So this is about praising students, right? It's about being enthusiastic in the classroom. It's about being enthusiastic about what we're about to do and also about what the students are achieving. Even when it's the smallest achievement, depending on their skills and their backgrounds, it's about showing enthusiasm. It's pretty simple. So I often hear heritage language teachers complain, and rightly, that it's nearly impossible to teach some students because their families do not speak the heritage language at home. But nonetheless, those students are in your classroom, and this is where it comes down to realistic goals. It's not a realistic goal that a student will be a native-like speaker from attending your classroom 2 hours per week for a few years if there is no language spoken at home. So that student will need a different goal. We can still teach them, but the goal might look different to someone who comes in speaking the language every day at home. This also comes back to good relationships. So for someone to produce a single sentence in the heritage language, this might be worth a lot of praise. But for someone else, it might be writing a paragraph in the heritage language. So it's about finding out what the student, it's also about finding out what the students' interests are and what their goals are. So what are the topics they want to learn? And how can we build this into our curriculum as much as possible? So, and this makes sense because students will not be motivated to learn unless they regard the material they are taught as worth learning. So as Dernier says, one of the most demotivating factors for learners is when they have to learn something that they cannot see the point of because it has no seeming relevance whatsoever to their lives from their perspectives, right? So we're going to look at some practical ideas for how we can link teaching and learning to students' interests, hopes, visions, and aspirations. So the first thing is to find out what their interests and aspirations and their experience are. So what you can see on the screen is just suggestions, and you will likely have many more. And indeed, I do encourage you to share in the chat if there's any strategies that you can think of that is worth sharing. But do take the time to find out more about your students from the students themselves. So you can interview them one-on-one. You can have group discussions with them, brainstorms such as who are the most important people in your lives, or the places that they want to visit, or their hobbies. You can also do questionnaires with them with semi-completed sentences, such as those that you can see on the screen. My favorite thing is, and of course you can write this in the heritage language, I love to, when they have to fill it in. I dislike, on Saturdays I like to, when I'm 25 I will, when I'm 55 I will. Ranking is also another great activity. It's one of my favorite activities, and I often share this one because it really can encourage engagement and language use. So in this activity, you would ask your students a question, such as the one on the screen. Your school newspaper wants you to take the time-space machine and go interview someone, anyone. Write down the names of 3 people you would like to interview, and in order of preference. So the students then have to think about 3 names individually of who they would like to interview for this school newspaper. But then we throw in a bit of a spanner in the wheels. We can throw in an element of surprise. So in this step, we say, sorry, I forgot to mention that you're writing the article in pairs, talk to the person next to you and agree on 3 names. In this step, the students need to negotiate the names with the person sitting next to them. So you might need to do some ability grouping here. So some of your learners might be able to do this in the heritage language, but some of them might need to use 2 or more languages or other resources to be able to negotiate their meaning. You can definitely have different rules for different groups in your classroom depending on the context. And then we can throw in another one. We can say, sorry, I forgot it's a group task. Now agree in groups of 4 and prepare a short justification in the heritage language for why you chose those people. So this activity, this ranking activity, follows a very common teaching strategy called think, pair, share. It's actually even a think, pair, square share, because we went from thinking individually to pairs and then to groups of 4 before we shared. So these activities, such as a think, pair, share, can be very useful for student engagement and language use. We often skip the think part when we teach in the classroom and go straight into the pair, where we say, for example, talk to the person next to you about this one. Or we even go straight into the sharing part, where we ask students, oh, can anyone tell me? And we have a whole class, a whole group discussion. But the think part is actually super important for language learners. And that is because a lot of your language learners need time to process the language and prepare for a response. And this just brings me to this illustration that I want to pause and just say a few words about. So we know from visiting classrooms and from talking to students and teachers that those who are most engaged in our classroom are those who are most proficient in the language. Those who are least proficient in the language are often quiet. Sometimes they are completely quiet for a whole lesson. And it's those students who are quiet, who are least proficient, they are the students who need to be most engaged. So students with the least proficiency are those who need to be most engaged in your classroom. But this tendency to exclude less proficient students is often pragmatic. So one heritage language teacher that I spoke to said that with limited heritage language, students with limited heritage language proficiency were very quiet in the classroom. And the teacher avoided asking them questions when there was a whole group or whole class discussion, because it would take too long for them to respond, if they were able to respond at all. So it was easier to maintain the flow if they were not asked the questions. And we know similar stories from mainstream education, where teachers avoid asking questions to students with limited language proficiency because it interrupts the flow of the lesson. So it's the least proficient students who need to be most engaged in the classroom. And I want to challenge you all to think about ways that you can include those students who are not as proficient in the heritage language. So this may include allowing them to draw on more languages for communication. It might include using strategies such as think, pair, share, again, the one that we did before, where the think part is super important because each and every student in your classroom are given time to actually prepare the responses. It might also include having smaller, more explicit goals for them. And other students, on the other hand, might have a rule that they can only use the target language in your classroom. So this is what we call differentiation. So this is where we differentiate and we target our teaching to meet the needs of individual students. So let's go back to the strategies for finding out about students' visions and their aspirations. So these ones are about finding out their visions in particular. So what are your students' visions? What are their goals? How do they see themselves in relation to your language in the future across personal, professional, and academic lives? So I'm going to talk you through some specific suggestions for how you can create a vision. And these particular strategies comes from Dernier and Hadfield's book on motivating learning. You can see the link to the book on the screen, and there's also references at the end. So for example, you could use a questionnaire here too, with partially filled in questions like my specific goals for this term are, actions or steps I need to take to accomplish these goals are, this is how I know that I have reached my goals. Or you could incorporate some arts and craft. This is also taken from Dernier's book, where students create a split mask of themselves and their language selves and how they feel about their languages. So students are asked to draw a line in the mask in any way they choose. So it could be like straight, wavy, vertical, whatever. And then you tell them that the different halves represent the different languages. So you might even have 3 lines, depending on how many languages they speak. And students then need to decorate these halves in ways that make sense to them. So they can use words, glue-on materials, or anything else. They will also need to explain their masks to each other and maybe even write a description of it. This activity is very similar to what we did earlier in the presentation. So it is about encouraging visualization. And in this case, it's an identity tree. So you ask the students to close their eyes and read out the script to them. When you're done, they open their eyes and you provide them with the material to create a poster or an identity tree where they show aspects of their core self and how their languages branch in different ways. So you can then ask them to add more things to the tree as their term goes or as the year progresses. So for example, things they would like to be able to do in their heritage language, like talk to their grandparents, do a job interview, watch a movie. And you can, of course, keep this tree in their books or whatever resources you have, and they can visit, revisit, come back to things later on. This one is very similar, but it's also about just about visualization. So again, ask them to close their eyes, read them the text. You can even play background music, make it a bit moody in the room. When you're finished, your students can share these visions within a group and even write them down. So all of these ideas also give you insight to what your students' aspirations are, what motivates your students, what ticks their box, you know. And can also be shared in pairs where the partner has to say something about the other person's visions to the whole class in the end. So you can go through this, you can collect it, you can identify what the things are and what it is that you would like to address in your teaching to help your students set realistic goals for what they might be able to achieve. Another very powerful way of teaching when it comes to language learning and to enhance motivation is through project-based learning and rich tasks. So
Sorry, Janica, I'm just going to interrupt for a second. We're going to have to wrap up soon, if you wouldn't mind.
Oh, yes. So how many minutes do I have left, Jana?
-2, but go.
Oh, -2. I'm sorry. All right. Thank you. I will wrap up. Thank you. So with the project-based learning and rich tasks, so these activities can be very engaging if you choose projects that has the potential to align with students' interests and aspirations. So they can also provide opportunities for very authentic language use, you know, that mimic the way that native speakers use the language in everyday situations. So in these activities, students are given a project to complete. They don't get the steps to do it, but instead they get told sort of what the end result is. So these can be things such as creating a newspaper for the heritage language schools, creating podcasts, cookbooks, photo exhibitions, animals, and so on. One important thing here is that to encourage motivation, the task needs to have a clear purpose. So it needs to have a purpose, it needs to be challenging, and it needs to have appropriate support. But again, it also allows for differentiation. So you can set that challenge to suit each individual student. So imagine that it's a newspaper, for example. Some students might write a long and complicated text, and others might write a shorter. And I do have more strategies, but I will stop there. And those strategies can be popped onto the PowerPoint that I will share with the organizers later on for sharing out. All right, that was me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janica. This was amazing and very inspiring. Lots of food for thought. And as we share your slides, I'm sure we will all want to try your strategies that you have. I'm just going to look at the chat and also ask if anybody has any questions. Please put them in the chat. Thank you very much. So I have, when you were asking about the whether or not the kind of other reasons why people were saying why people would be studying, we have some comments. Some children feel more accepted, secure, and confident in heritage language schools than in the mainstream schools. We also have a comment, credits for entering high school or university was another reason, but at the same time, it's not fun or it's not cool, so that's not very good. That's a shame. And let me see. Right, so the first question, what is the age range of these students?
So the students, are we thinking about the activities, or are we thinking about what we know about the students' aspirations?
I think I am not sure this was a question from
the aspirations. So, yeah,
yes,
so I can see it in the chat.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
the students, in the research that's been done, the students have been of varying ages. So there has been younger students, and there has been students up to, I know, at least around 14, as well as younger than that. I don't know that I can't recall that I have read any with students older than 14, although there are similar studies that have been of adults who have reflected back to their heritage language experience as well. So broad range of the students' ages.
Perfect. And there was another motivation that one of our daughters' motivation it's been our secret language.
Yeah. My daughter is the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And comment for a speaker from Kissy, I was surprised to see that so many people from this audience said that children go because their parents say they have to go. One of our 9 myths is that parents must drag their children to these classes. I suppose the myth we are trying to bust is that dragging is necessary or the only way.
Yeah. Parents must drag the children. Yeah, they don't, but particularly as the students get older and come into the high school years or the teenage years, this is where it starts competing with other activities. We see, at least in Australia, a big drop-off on student enrollments around the age of 13, because students want to do sport or other activities, and don't want to go to heritage language school anymore. And whether or not this is why the students actually go is, as you say, whether or not that's a myth or not, or if that's a perception around what we think about the students. So we do know that many students want to go to heritage language school. And as someone pointed out before, sometimes they like it more than going to their mainstream school as well. Creates a bit of a safe space where they can be and where they can be around other people and where they can try out different things and act in different ways. But I think, that idea of creating the motivation in the heritage language classroom is crucial to ensuring that the parents don't have to drag their children to the school.
We also have a question that has been slightly answered as well. Supposing you have a student who is learning the heritage language well, but the parents split up and the child lives with says, "Oh no, you don't need that. That was dad's or mom's idea." How can teachers get the child to stick with it without creating problems with the parents? And apparently there have been some lawsuits in the Netherlands about after divorce.
It is really hard in families, I think, to encourage and maintain heritage languages if there is not support from both parents. It's very tricky, particularly if there is not a big community around as well for their parents. So parents who might live geographically far away from other speakers of the language, it is an amazing achievement by those parents to maintain and keep the language alive at home, I think. And in this particular case, where we're supposing that the other partner is not really supportive, is very tricky. And I think that we're out of my field here, but my feeling would be that seeking support amongst, hopefully there is a strong network of people, of heritage speakers close by to that parent who can still help with supporting them motivation as well.
Yeah, we have another comment. The comment, in fact, you made about that you are not, or the school is not able to teach the child if the parents are not essentially speaking the other language or the language at home. As Vera said, I feel like we need to repeat this to the parents over and over again so that they remember it. And we had a question about how you interpret the results from the audience, from the conference participants, which basically said that the heritage language learning is not cool, is not fun.
Well, I think that we all in here can agree that it is cool and it is fun, but that the question was, what do we think that the students think? What's our anticipation around that? And I definitely think we all have the potential to make that classroom learning cool and fun. And I do think that a lot of students also see it as cool and fun. I think sometimes it's drawing on those things that are the students' interests that is important. What interests them, because that's where if you've seen a kid who's like really interested in something, working on it, and their focus and their attention to it, they get really invested in that activity. So if we can draw on that sense of aspiration, I think, and that's where it becomes cool too.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Janica.